From Orphanage to Empire, the story of Samuel Costa. The door of the São Vicente orphanage closed behind the social worker with a sound that Samuel Costa would never forget. He was only 6 years old, but he already understood that this noise meant the end of something. His mother wouldn't come back. No one would come for him. The smell of disinfectant mixed with reheated food invaded his nostrils as he clutched against his chest the only thing he had, a red plastic car with 3 wheels. "One more," murmured the director, Dona Carmen, a woman with broad shoulders and a tired gaze who had been running that place for 23 years. She had already seen hundreds of children pass through there. Some were adopted, others turned 18 and were thrown into the world without any structure. Samuel looked around and saw the other boys, 12 of them sharing a dormitory with peeling walls and rusty iron bunk beds. No one smiled at him. No one approached. In the first months, Samuel cried every night. He cried quietly with his face buried in the thin pillow that smelled of mold, so the others wouldn't hear. Because showing weakness there meant becoming a target. It meant you would be the last to eat, the one who would take the punches and shoves, the one who would carry the blame for anything that went wrong. He learned fast. The orphanage wasn't a place of shelter. It was a survival camp. At 9 years old, Samuel already had scars. One on his left eyebrow, the result of a fight over a piece of bread, another on his back, from when he was pushed down the stairs for looking wrong at one of the older boys. But the deepest scar was invisible. It was somewhere inside his chest, in that spot where there should be the feeling of belonging to someone, of being loved, of having a place in the world. There was only an immense void that he tried to fill with anger. "You're not going to amount to anything in life," said Mr. Augusto, the orphanage janitor, a bitter man who found pleasure in humiliating the children one day. Samuel had just accidentally broken a window while playing ball. "You'll die in the gutter like your mother probably died. Orphanage kids are good for nothing, they're all bums." Those words stuck deep. Samuel could have believed them. Many there did. He saw in the eyes of the other boys the resignation, the certainty that the world had no place for them. But something inside him refused to accept that fate. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the last remnant of a dignity he didn't even know he possessed. That night, lying in the bunk bed, he made a silent promise. One day, he would prove that man wrong. One day, he would be someone. The orphanage ran on sporadic donations and the goodwill of volunteers who showed up once a month. Food was scarce, watery beans, clumpy rice, and on lucky days, a piece of chicken. Clothes were hand-me-downs from other children, mended until they couldn't be anymore. Samuel wore sneakers 2 sizes too big, tied with string so they wouldn't fall off his feet. At night in winter, he slept in 2 shirts because there weren't enough blankets. But the worst wasn't the material poverty. It was the emptiness of purpose. It was waking up every day knowing that no one was waiting for you, that no one cared if you had dreams or nightmares, if you were hungry or afraid. It was growing up understanding that the world saw you as a number, a social problem, a statistic. It was carrying the weight of rejection in every cell of your body. When Samuel turned 11, something changed. A volunteer teacher named Roberto started giving tutoring classes at the orphanage twice a week. He was different from the other volunteers who showed up there with pity in their eyes and guilt in their conscience. Roberto looked at those children and saw potential. He saw wasted intelligence, undiscovered talents, lives that deserved a chance. "You are not what happened to you," he said in the first class, his words echoing in that makeshift room with broken chairs and a cracked blackboard. "You are what you choose to do from now on. The past is a scar, but it doesn't have to be a prison." Samuel was sitting in the back, arms crossed and an expression of distrust. He had already seen many adults promise things and disappear afterward. He had already learned not to believe in pretty words. But there was something about Roberto, maybe the firmness in his voice, maybe the way he looked directly into each person's eyes, that made Samuel pay attention. "Who here knows what they want to be when they grow up?" asked Roberto. Silence. Some nervous laughter. No one there thought about the future. The most they imagined was surviving the next day. It's okay not to know, but I'll tell you one thing. Each of you has the right to dream, and dreaming costs nothing. That night, for the first time in years, Samuel didn't think about the mother who abandoned him or the father he never knew. He didn't think about the humiliations and scars. He thought about something different, something he didn't even know how to name yet, but that was starting to grow inside him like a stubborn seed in barren soil. It was hope. And hope, he would soon discover, was the most dangerous and most powerful thing an abandoned child could have. Roberto brought books. They weren't new books. The covers were worn, the pages yellowed, some with notes from previous owners. But for Samuel, who had never had a book of his own, this was a treasure. The first one he received was called Think and Grow Rich. He was 12 years old and barely understood half the words, but he read with a hunger that surprised even himself. Wealth isn't about money, Roberto explained one afternoon, sitting next to Samuel in the dusty courtyard of the orphanage. It's about mindset. It's about believing you deserve more than what you were given. The richest people I know weren't born rich. They decided not to accept poverty as destiny. Samuel absorbed every word like a sponge. He discovered he liked numbers. While the other boys played ball or fought in the courtyard, he would solve math problems that Roberto brought. There was something comforting about the logic of numbers. They didn't lie, didn't reject, didn't abandon. 2 plus 2 would always be 4, regardless of where you were born or who your parents were. At 13, Samuel had his first big idea. He observed that many of the orphanage staff and people in the neighborhood needed small repairs, changing a light bulb, fixing a faucet, painting a wall. He started offering these services, learning through tutorials he found in old magazines that Roberto brought. He charged cheap, sometimes accepted food as payment. "You have an entrepreneurial spirit," said Roberto, with a proud smile. "Do you know what that means? It means you don't wait for opportunities to fall from the sky. You create your own opportunities." With the money he earned, Samuel bought a new notebook. Not those used ones they gave out at the orphanage, but a hardcover notebook, clean, full of possibilities. On the first page he wrote in large letters, "My goals." Below he listed, 1. Leave the orphanage with dignity. 2. Finish my studies. 3. Have my own business. 4. Never go hungry again. 5. Prove that orphanage kids can win. Life at the orphanage continued to be hard. Samuel still slept in the bunk bed, still wore mended clothes, still ate watery beans. But now he had something the others didn't. A plan. And more importantly, he had started to believe that plan was possible. At 15, Samuel expanded his small business. He started buying products wholesale, soaps, sponges, cleaning products, and resold them in the neighborhood. He discovered he had a knack for sales. He knew how to talk to people, understand what they needed, make them trust him. It wasn't about manipulating, it was about genuinely wanting to solve their problems. Business isn't about taking money from people, Roberto explained when Samuel shared his small accounting notebook with him. It's about creating value. If you solve a real problem, people will want to pay for it, and the better you solve it, the more they'll pay. But not everything was roses. The other boys at the orphanage started provoking him. They called him Little Rich Boy, uppity, said he thought he was better than everyone. Sometimes the provocation turned into aggression. Samuel took a punch to the nose that bled for 2 hours. He took a push that made him hit his head and see stars. But he didn't stop. "Why don't you give up?" asked one of the boys, Rodrigo, one day, after purposely breaking a box of products Samuel had just bought. "We're never going to get out of here. We have no family. We have nothing. Why keep deluding yourself?" Samuel looked at him, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "Because I'd rather die trying than live accepting. And when I leave here, I don't want to look back and see a coward." Director Donna Carmam watched Samuel with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had already seen many children full of dreams crushed by reality. She had already seen hopes turn into despair, plans turn into excuses. But there was something different about Samuel, a determination she rarely saw, a light in his eyes that poverty and abandonment couldn't extinguish. One night she called him to her office, a small, cramped room that smelled of old paper and reheated coffee. "Samuel, you know you'll have to leave here when you turn 18, right?" "I know." "And you know that most of the boys who leave here, well, they don't do very well out there. Some end up on the street, others in dead-end jobs, many turn to crime. I'm not going to be like most." Donna Carmen sighed. She had heard that before, but when she looked at that boy, thin, with scars on his face and mended clothes, but with eyes shining with conviction, she wanted to believe. "Then you're going to need more than willpower. You're going to need a real plan." Samuel opened his notebook, now full of notes, accounts, scribbled ideas. He showed her his earnings from the last few months, small but consistent. He showed a list of loyal customers. He showed a plan to expand. "I'm already building my exit," he said. "When I turn 18, I'm not leaving here empty-handed." At 16, Samuel had his first major obstacle. A supplier deceived him, selling defective products. He lost all the money he had saved over months, 300 reais that for him were worth a fortune. That night, he cried, not the silent tears of childhood, but deep sobs of frustration and anger. Roberto showed up at the orphanage 2 days later and found Samuel in the courtyard staring at nothing. "I heard what happened. I was an idiot. I trusted the wrong person. I lost everything." "No, you didn't lose everything. You gained the most valuable lesson an entrepreneur can learn. Not everyone is honest, and you need to protect your business. That was the price of your education, and it was cheap." "Cheap? It was everything I had. And you'll recover it. You'll rebuild. And this time you'll be smarter. The best entrepreneurs I know aren't those who never failed. They're those who failed, learned, and came back stronger." Samuel wiped his eyes. At that moment he made another decision. He wouldn't just leave the orphanage. He would leave victorious. He would build something so big that no one could ever diminish him again. The anger he felt at the mother who abandoned him, the father he never knew, the adults who humiliated him, the world that expected him to fail, that anger he would turn into fuel. 2 months later, Samuel had already recovered the lost money and had double. He had learned to be more cautious, to make simple contracts, to check products before paying. He had learned that distrust wasn't pessimism, it was protection. At 17, he had a small network of clients, a reputation for honesty, and a clear goal. When he turned 18 and left the orphanage, he would have seed capital to start something bigger. "Will you forget me when you're rich and famous?" joked Roberto on one of his last visits before Samuel came of age. "Never. You were the first person who made me believe I could be more than an orphan. When I have my company, you'll have a chair in my office." Roberto laughed, but his eyes were moist. He had seen many empty promises in that place, but when he looked at Samuel, he saw something rare, a boy who had been broken by the world and had decided to rebuild himself, not as a victim but as a warrior. And warriors, he knew, changed the world. The day Samuel turned 18 wasn't a celebration. There was no cake, candles, or presents. At 7 in the morning on a cold Monday, Donna Carmen knocked on the dormitory door with a brown envelope in her hands. Inside were his documents, a discharge form, and a generic letter of recommendation she wrote for all the boys who left. It was protocol. It was cold. It was the end. "You have until noon to gather your things and leave," she said, unable to look him in the eyes. She had done this dozens of times, but it never got easier. "There's a temporary shelter 3 blocks from here if you need a place to stay for the first few weeks." Samuel didn't need it. In recent months, while saving every possible penny, he had rented a tiny room in a boarding house on the other side of town. It cost 200 reais a month, a room without a window, with a mattress on the floor, a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and cockroaches that came out at night. But it was his. For the first time in his life, he would have a space that was just his. At 11:30 in the morning, Samuel walked through the gate of São Vicente orphanage for the last time. He carried a worn backpack with his few clothes, his notebooks, the book Roberto had given him, and 350 reais in cash, his entire fortune. He didn't look back. If he did, he knew he would see the life that almost swallowed him, and he couldn't afford nostalgia or regret. The boarding house was in a violent neighborhood on the outskirts. At night, you could hear gunshots. The smell of sewage rose from the streets when it rained. Men sold drugs on the corner without even trying to disguise it. But Samuel wasn't afraid. Growing up in the orphanage had taught him to recognize danger and navigate through it. He had learned when to lower his head and when to face it. His plan was simple, but audacious. He would buy products in large quantities from wholesalers, cleaning supplies, household items, hygiene products, and resell them in small stores and markets in the neighborhood. The margin was small, but volume could compensate. He just needed consistency and hard work. And hard work was something he had in abundance. The first month was brutal. Samuel woke up at 5 in the morning, took 2 buses to the distribution center, negotiated prices with suppliers who treated him with disdain for being young and without credibility, carried heavy boxes on his shoulders because he didn't have money for freight, and spent the entire day knocking door to door offering his products. At night he fell exhausted on the mattress, his back aching, his feet covered in blisters. Many doors closed in his face. Many store owners laughed at him. Kid wanting to do adult business, they mocked. Come back when you at least have a beard on your face. But Samuel didn't give up. For every 10 doors that closed, 1 opened, and that single door was all he needed. He met Mr. Manuel, owner of a decrepit little market, who agreed to place a small order. I'll give you a chance, kid, but if you let me down, don't ever come back here. Samuel delivered the products on time with quality, and at a better price than the previous supplier. The following week, Mr. Manuel doubled the order. You know why I'm buying from you? Asked the old merchant one day as Samuel unloaded boxes. It's not because you're cheaper. It's because I see fire in your eyes. I see a boy who won't give up, and I like to bet on those who are hungry to win. Those words sustained Samuel through the following months, because there were moments when giving up seemed the only sensible option, like when he was mugged on his way home and lost all the week's money, like when a customer disappeared without paying, leaving him at a loss, like when he got dengue fever and spent a week feverish in that airless room with no one to take care of him, surviving on water and crackers. But there was something in him that refused defeat. Maybe it was the years of humiliation at the orphanage, which had forged in him a shell harder than steel. Maybe it was the memory of Mr. Augusto saying he would amount to nothing. Maybe it was the promise he had made to himself. It didn't matter. Every time he fell, he got up. Every time life beat him, he fought back. At 19, Samuel already had 15 regular customers and a monthly income that, although modest, allowed him to eat 3 meals a day and pay rent without desperation. He rented a small warehouse to store the products and hired a boy from the neighborhood to help him with deliveries. He was growing. Slowly, but growing. It was at this time that he met Juliana. She worked as a cashier in one of the markets where he delivered products. She was 21 years old, had a smile that lit up the environment, and a story as difficult as his. She had run away from home at 16 to escape a violent stepfather. They started talking during deliveries, short conversations at first, but they deepened. You always seem so focused, she said one day. You never stop, never complain. Don't you get tired? I do, but being tired is a luxury I can't afford yet. If I stop, I go back to where I started, and I'd rather die than go back. Juliana understood him in a way few people would. She also knew the feeling of starting from absolute zero, of waking up not knowing if she would have food, of carrying the weight of a past that others judged. They started meeting outside the market. Walks in the park, conversations late into the night. She was the first person with whom Samuel shared his dreams without fear of being ridiculed. One day I'm going to have my own company, he said one night, sitting on a park bench eating cheap sandwiches. Not a little shop, something big, something that gives jobs to hundreds of people, something that makes a difference. I believe in you, said Juliana. And unlike all the other times someone had said that, Samuel felt she really believed. But growth brought new problems. One of his competitors, a man named Cicero who controlled much of the informal trade in the neighborhood, didn't like seeing a kid taking his customers. First came veiled threats. Then one of his warehouses was broken into and vandalized. Samuel lost 3,000 reais in destroyed merchandise. "Come talk to me," Cicero sent word through an intermediary. It was less an invitation and more an order. Samuel went. He found Cicero in a dirty bar surrounded by henchmen. The man was fat, with gold chains around his neck and a look that said he wasn't used to hearing no. "You have two options, kid," he said, blowing cigarette smoke in Samuel's face. "Work for me and I'll protect you, or continue alone and watch everything you built turn to dust." Samuel felt his heart race. He knew this was a decisive moment. If he accepted, he would be safe, but would be just another employee. He would be selling his freedom, his dream, everything he had fought for. If he refused, he would be risking everything. He could lose all his investment. He could even lose his life. He looked at Cicero and saw something the orphanage had taught him to recognize: a predator who only respected strength. "With all due respect," said Samuel, choosing each word carefully, "I don't work for anyone. If you want to do business, we can be partners, but I'm not your employee." The silence was tense. The henchman moved, waiting for a signal. Cicero studied that thin boy full of scars who had the courage to face him. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed. "You've got courage, I'll give you that. But courage without intelligence is suicide. I'll give you a month. If you survive, we'll talk again." Samuel left that bar trembling but alive, and with one certainty: he wasn't just going to survive. He was going to prosper in a way Cicero had never imagined. Because while men like Cicero built empires through fear, Samuel would build his through something much more powerful: trust. And in the end, he knew, trust always beats fear. Block 4. The turning point. Samuel was 21 years old when he made the decision that would change everything. He was tired of being just a middleman, buying products from third parties and reselling them with tight margins. He wanted to produce. He wanted to have total control of the supply chain. And he had identified an opportunity: ecological cleaning products. The market was growing, but they were still expensive and inaccessible to most people. "You're crazy," said Juliana when he shared the idea. They now lived together in a small but decent apartment. "You don't have money to set up a factory. You don't have technical knowledge, and you're going to compete with giant brands." "I know, but all those giant brands started small. Someone had to be first. Why not me?" With the 15,000 reais he had saved over 3 years of insane work, Samuel rented a tiny warehouse and bought used equipment. He spent months studying formulations, testing ingredients, learning basic chemistry through online videos and library books. He burned his skin with chemicals. He had accidental explosions that nearly set the warehouse on fire, but he didn't give up. His first product was a multi-purpose cleaner based on natural ingredients. Simple, effective, and 30% cheaper than competitors. He designed the labels by hand, printed them on cheap printers, and stuck them on the bottles. The result was rough but honest. "Made with dedication by someone who understands the value of every cent," the label said. The first sale was to Mr. Manuel, the owner of the small market who had believed in him from the beginning. "I'll put 10 units on the shelf," said the old man, "but it has to work. You hear? My reputation is also at stake." It worked. In 1 week, the 10 units were gone. Mr. Manuel ordered 20, then 50. Other merchants began to notice. In 3 months, Samuel had product in 40 stores. He worked 18 hours a day, producing in the morning, selling in the afternoon, delivering at night. He slept 4 hours and started over. Juliana quit her cashier job to help him. She took care of the administrative part, controlled inventory, managed finances, dealt with suppliers. "We're a team," she said. "If you're going to build an empire, I'll be by your side." But growth brought crises. Samuel received a notification from the health department. His warehouse didn't have the proper licenses. He would need to invest in improvements that would cost more than 40,000 reais, money he didn't have. It was either regularize or close. There was no middle ground. "It's over," he told Juliana that night, with the letter crumpled in his hands. "I worked 3 years to build this, and I'm going to lose everything because of bureaucracy. It's not over. We'll get a loan. No bank is going to lend me money. I have no collateral, no credit history. I'm a former orphan with a high school diploma. To banks, I'm a risk." But Juliana didn't give up. She researched for days and found a government microcredit program for small entrepreneurs. The interest rate was high, but it was the only chance. Samuel filled out the form, gathered documents, wrote a detailed business plan, and waited. The wait was agony. 2 months without a response. During this time, he had to stop production. He lost clients. He watched competitors take his space. There were nights when he woke up in panic, sweating cold, with the feeling that everything was falling apart. The loan approval came on a rainy Thursday. 50,000 reais. Samuel read the email 3 times to make sure he wasn't dreaming. When reality hit him, he hugged Juliana and cried, not from sadness but from relief and gratitude. It was the first time someone, even if it was a government institution, believed in him enough to invest in his dream. He regularized everything. Hired 2 more employees. Doubled production. Started investing in marketing. Simple flyers, social media posts, partnerships with local influencers. The EcoClean brand began to gain recognition. It wasn't just another cleaning product. It was the story of a young man who had come from nothing and was building something of value. At 23, Samuel took the next big step. He got a meeting with a regional supermarket chain. It was the chance to leave the small stores and enter real retail. It meant multiplying sales by 10. But it also meant bigger commitments, tighter deadlines, higher standards. The purchasing director was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit and luxury watch, who looked at Samuel with that mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "You're too young to be here," he said, flipping through the proposal Samuel had prepared. "And your brand is unknown. Why should I risk shelf space in my stores with your product?" Samuel took a deep breath. He had rehearsed that moment dozens of times in the mirror. Because you're not just buying a product. You're buying a story that your customers will want to support. Every bottle of EcoClean represents a person who refused to accept the destiny the world chose for them. And that, sir, sells. There was silence. The director studied that thin young man in simple but clean clothes, with scars on his face and fire in his eyes. "Tell me your story." And Samuel told it, without self-pity, without victimhood. He told about the orphanage, about working since childhood, about building his business from scratch. He told about almost giving up 1,000 times and getting up 1,001. When he finished, he saw something rare in the director's eyes: respect. "I'll give you a chance. 3 months, 20 pilot stores. If it sells well, we expand. If it doesn't sell, it's over." Samuel shook his hand so hard it almost hurt. That handshake was more than a commercial agreement. It was recognition that he had reached a new level. He was no longer the boy from the orphanage. He was Samuel Costa, businessman. The 3 months were of maximum tension. Samuel invested all the money he had in production, hired more employees, rented a larger warehouse, put everything on the line. If it didn't work out, he would be bankrupt and in debt. But if it worked, it would be the beginning of something extraordinary. It worked. Sales exceeded expectations by 40%. Customers sent emails praising the quality. Store owners asked for more stock. In 6 months, EcoClean was in all the chain's stores. In 1 year, Samuel was negotiating with national chains. At 25, he had a company with 30 employees and an annual revenue of 2 million reais. He wasn't a billionaire, but he was far from poor. He bought a real apartment for himself and Juliana, bought new clothes, ate in restaurants where before he could only look through the window. But most importantly, he proved to himself that he had won. One day, he received an invitation to speak at an entrepreneurship event. The journey of those who started from zero was the theme. Samuel had never spoken in public to a large audience. He was nervous, sweated cold. But when he got on stage and saw hundreds of people looking at him, young people with the same hungry eyes he had had, people seeking inspiration, people who needed to believe it was possible, he knew what he had to do. "My name is Samuel Costa," he began, his voice firm, "and I grew up in an orphanage." The rest of the story flowed naturally. He told everything, the humiliations, the fears, the falls, the victories. When he finished, the audience was on their feet, applauding. But what touched Samuel most were the people who approached him afterward. Young people from peripheries, children from broken families, people who had been told they would never be anything. "You gave me hope," said a 16-year-old boy with tears in his eyes. In that moment, Samuel understood that his purpose was bigger than just building a profitable company. It was to show every abandoned child, every marginalized youth, every person forgotten by society, that they had value, that they could win, that the past didn't determine the future. Block 5. The Empire. At 28, Samuel Costa was no longer just the owner of an ecological cleaning products brand. He was the CEO of EcoCorp, a company that had expanded into natural cosmetics, sustainable personal hygiene products, and industrial cleaning solutions. He had more than 200 employees, presence in all Brazilian states, and annual revenue exceeding 50 million reais. But growth hadn't been linear or easy. There was the year when a defective batch caused allergies in dozens of customers. Samuel had to recall all products, reimburse each affected person, and rebuild brand trust. It cost him 2 million reais and months of sleepless nights. "This is how you differentiate a real businessman from an opportunist," he said in an interview. "When you make a mistake, you own it and fix it, no excuses." There was the sabotage attempt by a competitor who spread rumors that his products were fraudulent. Samuel had to hire lawyers, sue for defamation, prove with documents and laboratory tests that everything was legitimate. He won the case, but the legal battle drained energy and resources. There was the economic crisis that almost broke the company. Demand plummeted, costs rose, suppliers began demanding advance payment. Samuel had to lay off 15 people, one of the most painful decisions he ever made. He looked each one in the eye, explained the situation, helped find new placements. "You're not just numbers. You're people who trusted me, and I won't forget that." But each crisis strengthened him. Each storm he survived taught him new lessons. He learned to diversify, not to depend on a single customer or supplier. He learned to save reserves for difficult times. He learned that growing too fast was as dangerous as not growing. He learned that the right people were worth more than any technology or investment. It was during this time that Roberto reappeared, the teacher who had planted the first seed of hope in the 11-year-old boy from the orphanage. Samuel hadn't seen him in over 10 years. Roberto had aged, gray hair, slightly curved back, but his eyes remained the same, full of that kindness that had saved Samuel. "I saw a report about you in a magazine," Roberto said when they met in a fancy downtown cafe. "I couldn't believe it. The boy from the orphanage is now on the cover of business magazines." Samuel smiled, but his eyes welled up. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. You were the first person who told me I could be more than what the world expected of me. I never forgot. You did everything yourself, Samuel. I just lit the match. You're the one who had the courage to carry the torch." Samuel then did something he had been planning for years. He opened a folder and handed it to Roberto. Inside, there was a contract and a check. "Remember when I said you'd have a chair in my office? Well, now I have a real office, and I want you to be the director of social responsibility at EcoCorp. Your job will be to create programs to help vulnerable young people become entrepreneurs. Salary of 150,000 reais per year." Roberto was speechless. He looked at the check, at the contract, at that man he had known as a boy with scars and impossible dreams. "Samuel, I don't know what to say." "Say yes, and help me do for others what you did for me." Roberto accepted, and together they created the SEEDS program, an initiative that identified young people from orphanages and underprivileged communities with entrepreneurial potential and offered mentorship, initial capital, and structural support. In the first year, they helped 20 young people open their own businesses. Of those 20, 16 were still active after 2 years, an extraordinary success rate for micro-enterprises. Samuel became a public figure. He appeared on TV shows, gave interviews to newspapers, was invited to events. But he never forgot where he came from. Whenever he spoke, he mentioned the orphanage, mentioned the difficulties, not to victimize himself, but to inspire. "If I could do it," he would say, "anyone can. The starting point doesn't determine the destination." But exposure brought criticism. People said he was the exception, not the rule. That using his story was opportunism. That one swallow doesn't make a summer. "For every Samuel Costa who succeeds," wrote a columnist, "there are 1,000 orphanage children who die in misery. Celebrating his success is ignoring systemic failure." That hurt. Samuel knew it was true. He was indeed an exception. He was lucky to meet Roberto. He was lucky to have the right stubbornness at the right time. He was lucky not to be killed by a stray bullet or sucked into drug trafficking. But did that mean he shouldn't try? That he should hide his success out of guilt? "No," said Juliana when he shared his doubts. "You can't save everyone, but you can save some, and those some can save others. That's how you change the world, one person at a time." Motivated by this, Samuel intensified his social efforts. He donated 1 million reais to renovate the São Vicente orphanage, the place that had been his hell and his forge. He went there personally to oversee the work. Dona Carmen was still the director, now almost 70 years old. "You came back," she said when she saw him, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "I promised I would come back. And I promised that when I came back, it would be to help." The renovations transformed the orphanage. Walls were painted, bunk beds replaced with decent beds, a library was installed, a sports court built. But more important than the physical structure, Samuel implemented a mentorship program. Successful business people adopted an orphanage child, not legally but professionally. They visited regularly, taught about business, created perspectives. "Structure is important," Samuel explained at the inauguration of the renovations. "But what these children need most is to believe they're capable. They need someone who looks at them and sees potential, not pity." At 30, Samuel married Juliana in a simple ceremony. They didn't want ostentation. They invited 50 people, close friends, loyal employees, children from the orphanage. Roberto was his best man. Mr. Manuel, the first merchant who believed in him, was the guest of honor. "I never thought I'd get here," Samuel said in his wedding speech, looking at Juliana with shining eyes. "Not just at this altar, but in this life. There was a time when I thought I would die alone, invisible, just another number in a statistic of the forgotten. But every person in this room has proven to me that there is goodness in the world, that there is hope, and that love, whether romantic, friendship, or mentorship, is the most transformative force that exists." The company continued to grow. Samuel began receiving proposals from international investors interested in expanding EcoCorp to other Latin American countries. The proposals were tempting: millions of dollars in investment, access to gigantic markets, the possibility of becoming a global brand. But Samuel was cautious. He had seen many entrepreneurs lose their companies by accepting investments that diluted their stake too much. He had seen brands that started with purpose become just another soulless product when venture capital took control. "I didn't build this to get rich," he said in a meeting with potential American investors. "I built it to prove something, to myself and to every child who is where I was. If accepting your money means losing control of the mission, then I don't accept." The investors didn't like it. They called him naive, emotional, a bad businessman. "You're leaving money on the table," they said. Samuel smiled. "Maybe, but I've been hungry all my life. I survived until now. I'll survive without your millions." But he found the right investors, a social impact fund that valued mission as much as profit. He accepted an investment of $10 million that allowed him to expand to Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, while maintaining 60% ownership of the company and total control of strategic decisions. At 32, Samuel Costa was on the Forbes list of the most influential young entrepreneurs in Latin America. EcoCorp was worth more than $100 million. He had 400 employees. He was internationally recognized. But when asked what his greatest achievement was, he never talked about money or recognition. "My greatest achievement," he would always say, "is every message I receive from a young person saying that my story inspired them not to give up. It's every child from the Seeds program who opens their first business. It's knowing that the orphanage boy the world had thrown away is now creating opportunities so others won't be thrown away too." Samuel Costa was 35 years old when he received the invitation that would change not only his trajectory, but potentially that of thousands of people. The Ministry of Social Development wanted him to lead a national entrepreneurship program for young people in vulnerable situations. It would mean temporarily leaving the daily management of EcoCorp. It would mean diving into the bureaucratic chaos of government. It would mean frustration, slowness, and probably very little glory. "You should accept," said Juliana. They now had 2 children, Miguel, 3 years old, and Helena, 1. Life had given them the family that neither had in childhood. "This is what you built everything for, to be able to make a difference at scale." Samuel knew she was right. EcoCorp was prosperous and stable. He had a competent executive team that could handle day-to-day operations. Roberto was doing exceptional work with social programs. It was time to expand the impact. He accepted, and dove into a completely different world from private entrepreneurship. In government, every decision went through 10 layers of approval. Every initiative faced political resistance. Every real spent was scrutinized. It was frustrating and exhausting. But Samuel had survived the orphanage. He had built a company from scratch. Bureaucracy wouldn't defeat him. He created Young Entrepreneurial Brazil, a program that identified young people from underprivileged communities, orphanages, and peripheries with entrepreneurial profiles, and offered intensive training, individualized mentorship, and access to microcredit with special conditions. It wasn't charity, it was investment. Young people had to present solid business plans, show commitment, accept being evaluated, and held accountable. "I don't want welfare recipients," Samuel said to the first class of the program, looking at the 100 young people selected from 5,000 applicants. "I want entrepreneurs. I want people willing to sweat blood for their dream, because dreams without work are just illusions." In the first 2 years, the program helped 500 young people open their businesses. The survival rate of the companies was 70%, extraordinary compared to the national average of 25%. Bakeries, beauty salons, technology services, online stores, consultancies. Each business was a story of overcoming. Each entrepreneur was a potential Samuel. One of the young women was Mariana, 23 years old, who had grown up in an orphanage in Recife. She created a clothing brand made with recycled fabrics, and in 2 years was selling to stores in 5 states. "You showed me that being from an orphanage isn't a curse," she told Samuel at a program event. "It's just a chapter. The whole story depends on what we write after." But not everything was flowers. There were scandals. One of the regional coordinators of the program was caught embezzling resources. Samuel had to face the press, explain that one case of corruption didn't invalidate all the work, fire the person responsible, and implement stricter controls. It was wearing. Newspapers questioned his competence. Opposition politicians used the scandal to attack the government. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," he told Roberto on a particularly difficult night. "In the private sector, if someone steals, you fire them and move on. Here it becomes a national headline." "That's exactly why you need to stay," Roberto replied. "Because you don't run when it gets hard. You're living proof that integrity and success can go together. If you give up now, what message does that send to the young people in the program?" Samuel stayed, strengthened controls, increased transparency, started publishing detailed quarterly reports on every cent spent, invited the press to visit the businesses created by the program. The narrative began to change, from corrupt program to initiative that's changing lives despite difficulties. At 38, Samuel was physically exhausted, but spiritually fulfilled. EcoCorp continued to grow under the executive team's management. The government program had helped more than 2,000 young people in 5 years. But he knew he needed something more permanent, something that would survive changes in government, economic crises, Samuel himself. He created the Samuel Costa Institute, a non-profit organization funded with 20% of EcoCorp's profits. The mission was simple and ambitious: eradicate the predetermined destiny of abandoned children in Brazil. The institute would have 3 pillars: entrepreneurial education in orphanages, long-term mentorship, and a permanent microcredit fund. "It's not about me," Samuel said at the institute's launch. "It's about creating a system that works even when I'm no longer here." How many Samuels are out there, with giant potential, but without the luck to find a Roberto? How many brilliant children are rotting in orphanages because no one looked at them and said, "You're capable"? That's what we need to change. The institute started small but grew quickly. Successful business people volunteered as mentors. Other companies followed EcoCorp's example and began donating percentages of their profits. In 3 years, the institute was present in 18 states, directly impacting 5,000 children per year. One of the most striking stories was that of João, a 13-year-old boy from an orphanage in Salvador, who participated in the entrepreneurial education program. He had all the characteristics Samuel recognized in himself: wasted intelligence, contained anger, desire to prove his worth. João created a cell phone repair business at 16. At 18, when he left the orphanage, he already had stable income and 15,000 reais saved. "I was going to join drug trafficking," João confessed to Samuel years later. "It seemed like the only path. But then you appeared, told your story, and I thought, if that guy made it, I can too." Samuel hugged the boy, now a young man, and cried, because he knew exactly what it was like to be on the edge of that abyss. He knew how much a single person believing in you could change everything. And now he was that person for hundreds, maybe thousands of young people. At 40, Samuel received the Entrepreneur of the Year award at a prestigious ceremony. He was on stage, in an elegant suit that contrasted brutally with the patched clothes of his childhood, holding a crystal trophy that probably cost more than he had earned in years selling cleaning products door to door. But when he began his acceptance speech, he didn't talk about business success or financial numbers. He talked about a 6-year-old boy being left at an orphanage. He talked about hunger, about humiliation, about wanting to give up 1,000 times. He talked about the people who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. "This award isn't mine," he said, his voice choked. "It belongs to every child who is right now in an orphanage, thinking they have no future. It belongs to every young person from the periphery that the world has already condemned before giving them a chance. It belongs to every person who was abandoned, rejected, forgotten, but who refused to accept that that was their final destiny." He paused, looked at the audience of business people, investors, and opinion makers. "Do you want to make a real difference? Stop looking for the next tech unicorn. Look for the next Samuel, that boy or girl everyone ignored but who has enough fire inside to light up the world. Invest in these people. Mentor these people. Believe in these people. Because I promise, they'll return it multiplied." The audience was silent for a moment. Then slowly, they began to stand, one by one, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding. It wasn't the polite applause of corporate events. It was genuine ovation, the kind that gave you goosebumps. That night, Samuel came home and found Juliana waiting up. "How was it?" "I won the award, made a speech, received many compliments." He took off his suit, sat on the sofa, and looked at his own hands. Hands that had carried heavy boxes, that had bled from so much work, that had trembled with fear and hunger. "But you know what struck me most today? At the end, a gentleman came to talk to me. He said he had been a bank manager and that 20 years ago he denied a loan to a young ex-orphan who wanted to start a business. He said he thought about that young man his whole life, wondering what would have happened if he had given him a chance. And he said that because of my story, he now dedicates time to mentoring young entrepreneurs. Juliana smiled, her eyes welling up. You didn't just change your life, Samuel. You're changing how people see the forgotten. It's still not enough. There are still thousands of children in orphanages. There's still so much injustice. But there's more hope than there was, and hope multiplies. You planted seeds that will grow long after you. That's legacy. Samuel looked at the room where his children slept. Miguel and Helena would never know what real hunger was. They would never know what it was to feel abandoned. But he would make sure they knew what it was to have empathy, what it was to use privilege to help others, what it was to understand that they were lucky and that with luck came responsibility. At 45, Samuel Costa was one of the country's most influential business people. EcoCorp was worth $400 million. The Samuel Costa Institute had impacted more than 50,000 young people. The Young Entrepreneurial Brazil program had become permanent public policy, surviving 3 changes in government. But when people asked about his greatest pride, he told about a letter he had received. It was from a 15-year-old girl from an orphanage in the interior of Bahia. She wrote by hand, with awkward handwriting. Mr. Samuel, I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted you to know that your story saved my life. I was going to run away from the orphanage and do bad things. I thought I had no choice. But I saw you in a video at school telling your story, and I thought, if he made it, maybe I can too. Now I'm studying to enter your institute's program. I'm going to be a businesswoman. I'm going to be like you. Thank you for not giving up. Because when you didn't give up on yourself, you didn't give up on me either. Samuel kept that letter in his wallet. On difficult days, and there were still many, he reread it. He remembered why he had survived the orphanage, why he had worked to exhaustion, why he had endured humiliations and defeats. It wasn't just for him, it was for every child who would come after, every young person who needed to see that the impossible was possible. The boy abandoned in an orphanage at 6 years old had become one of the country's most influential entrepreneurs. But more important than that, he had become living proof that origin isn't destiny, that abandonment doesn't define worth, that every person, no matter where they started, deserves the chance to write their own story. And Samuel Costa had decided to dedicate the rest of his life to ensuring that as many as possible had that chance. Because he knew better than anyone that sometimes all a forgotten child needs is one person who looks at them and says, I believe in you. And those words, he discovered, had the power to change the world.